It's wishful thinking to ask about diplomacy when Israel's about to launch a ground invasion of Gaza and daily rocket exchanges with Lebanon's Hezbollah raise the prospect of a second front. But escalation is madness, and the world sure does not need this cycle of polarization and radicalisation. Diplomacy is not dead, although it may seem like it's on life support. We'll ask about Richie Sunak in Israel after Joe Biden, the King of Jordan, traveling to Egypt, and the German defense minister landing in Lebanon. So many peace efforts have failed over the past 3 decades that the international community, well, grew tired of trying, instead hoping that Israel's U.S.-brokered normalization of ties with Arab states would induce a kind of trickle-down positive effect on the Palestinians. We now know where that has led. Who brokers a path to real reconciliation? Hamas may be crushed militarily, but not its ideology. So who to negotiate with on the Palestinian side? And what about Israel, whose sitting prime minister pandered to Jewish far-right settlers intent on subjugating the West Bank rather than negotiating with it? How to break this deadly cycle of hate? Today in the France 24 debate, is it too late for diplomacy? Joining us from Washington, she's a past diplomatic negotiator for the Palestinian Authority, human rights attorney Zaha Hassan, fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
He's a researcher at the French International Affairs think tank IRIS. Former French diplomat Jean de Glignasty was Paris's consul in Jerusalem. We should probably point out to our viewers that consul in Jerusalem is kind of like ambassador to the Palestinian territories. Indeed, the ambassador speaks to Israel and the consul speaks to the Palestinians.
It's a special point on the diplomatic map of France. It's an exception.
And you were there at a special time in the
Yes,
1990s
indeed.
when the Oslo Accords were signed. We'll talk perhaps about that more later. France 24's Shirley Sitbon. How are you holding up, Shirley?
Well, we're following all these devastating news, obviously, and fearful for what's going to happen next.
That's right. Later, we'll be joined by Gershon Baskin, who acted as go-between in negotiations with Hamas for the release of Franco-Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, today columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. As always, there's what's important, a lasting solution for peace in the region. Let's start, though, with what's urgent. And what's urgent is the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, still shut, although the pledge has come in that if Friday is the day. Already they have sent in machinery to try to fix some of the roads. Israel's pledge to Joe Biden to conditionally allow humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip on the cards. Charlotte Hughes has more.
Trucks full of humanitarian aid continue to amass at the Egyptian border. About 20 of them have now been allowed to cross into Gaza after Israel agreed it would not block aid from Egypt. Volunteers have been camping on the Egyptian side as they wait for the border to open.
I've been here at the Rafah border crossing for our Palestinian brothers since the 7th of October. We are staying here for Palestinians. We will not leave until the aid enters Palestine, to Gaza, to our Palestinian brothers.
Some of the trucks here have been waiting for nearly a week, and more aid is on the way as it continues to be flown into Egypt, including from the EU.
If we put together the cargo of the flight from Monday and the one going today, we are talking about 56 or 54 tons, rather, of essential humanitarian supplies. This includes hygiene items, sanitary material, but also food, water, and shelter.
The request to open the crossing was made by US President Joe Biden on his visit to Israel. He welcomed Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's cooperation, but warned that continuing the aid depended on Hamas's response. Sisi, for his part, pointed the finger at Israel.
I reaffirm that Egypt continues to receive humanitarian aid and is committed to transferring that aid to the Gaza Strip through the Rafah crossing when conditions permit. Developments on the ground and the repeated bombings by Israel of the Palestinian side of the crossing have prevented operations.
This area near the Rafah crossing was recently hit by an Israeli strike, damaging infrastructure including key roads and killing several Palestinians. The checkpoint is the only passage in and out of Gaza that isn't controlled by Israel, who cut off supplies of water, electricity, fuel and food to the Palestinian enclave after Hamas's attack.
So there you saw in that report, Shirley Sitbon, the Egyptian president talking about the fact that there's been bombings in the areas near that Rafah border crossing. We heard the head of the World Health Organization wondering if it's even going to be possible to do this on Friday. Our correspondent in Cairo saying it would be first kind of 20 trucks maybe, see if it works, and then have more. Of course, for all of this, don't you need a ceasefire?
I guess you do, but on the current situation with the humanitarian crisis that may worsen, well, they need that aid. So are they going to wait longer to negotiate something now that the Israelis and Hamas say this is out of the question? The Israelis say this is not a time for ceasefire. We're planning the ground operation. So how much longer will the Palestinians wait? Humanitarians on site say help is needed, aid is needed right away, and they fear the worst. And of course, this is a major concern for the Americans, for the British, for all of Israel's allies. They've said it many times.
Zaha Hassan, what can we expect at that Rafah border crossing if there isn't a ceasefire?
I shudder to think if we don't get to a ceasefire. I was very shocked that the U.S. blocked a humanitarian pause even at the UN Security Council. That was voted down. I mean, just as your previous speaker said, this cannot wait. You know, the idea that 2.3 million people are going without food and water and medical supplies and fuel and all of these things that you need to distribute the aid across Gaza is unconscionable. We absolutely need a ceasefire, and we need it now to allow for this entry of these goods. Now, Egypt obviously has its concerns about not wanting to see, its sovereignty compromised by an influx of Palestinians who are already refugees inside of Israel. The person or the entity that is responsible for the well-being of the Palestinians of Gaza, it must be understood, is the occupying power. Israel is still considered the occupying power over the Gaza Strip. So it's not acceptable that it should say that it washes its hands of responsibility over bringing in or allowing in food and water and supplies. It should be bringing those things in itself from its crossings inside of Gaza. It has a responsibility. It has an obligation under international law to take care of the civilians, and so it needs to not wait for Egypt and negotiations around a ceasefire. It needs to bring those things in now, or it will find itself having more complaints at the International Criminal Court than it does at the present time.
Yeah, certainly the pressure has been piling on from Israel's allies. And we saw Olaf Scholz there on Tuesday. We saw Joe Biden in Israel on Wednesday. This Thursday it was Rishi Sunak, Tel Aviv, kind of the new Kyiv, with Western leaders flying in to express support, the UK Prime Minister, who met with his Israeli counterpart. Here's what he said before the cameras.
You describe this as Israel's darkest hour. Well, then it's for me to say I'm proud to stand here with you in Israel's darkest hour. As your friend, we will stand with you in solidarity. We will stand with your people, and we also want you to win.
Yeah, the UK Prime Minister, who also called for that humanitarian aid to come in and who distanced himself slightly from the, not more than slightly, non-committal when it comes to the U.S. backing up Israel's version on what happened at the Gaza hospital, saying for now it's too soon to tell. We're still going over the evidence. But the pressure is building on Israel to let in the humanitarian aid.
Yes. And I must understand, I must say I don't understand very well what's happening, because from the beginning the Israelis said that the South will be immune from bombing. So in fact, the ceasefire should exist in the southern part of Gaza. And so the aid should go to the southern part of Gaza without problems. So there is something which is not completely understandable here.
Well, we can say that also the Israelis hoped to get the liberation of some hostages in exchange for this, but they're not getting anywhere. So now they have this pressure where they have to let in the aid without getting any hostages back.
Because it's been more than a week now.
Yes, yes. So they're still, we're all waiting to see how the operations evolve. But yes, I think they're still asking themselves those questions, still consulting, and that raises some concern among Joe Biden even, who said, what's going to happen at the end? What's the scenario? I'm hearing the goal of getting rid of Hamas, but I don't see what the plan is exactly, what will be at the end.
We'll talk maybe more about that issue of what the military objective is and whether it has changed since October the 7th. Here in France, we have seen that heightened tensions over what's going on in the Middle East. France, home to Europe's largest Muslim population, largest Jewish population. We've just had in the last minutes a court lift a ban that had been slapped by the prefecture on rallying. So there's been a rally taking place at Paris's Place de la République as we speak. It's the same kind of situation in places like the UK, where you have those who are strongly in support of Israel, those that are strongly in support of the Palestinian cause. For Scotland's new First Minister, this whole issue is personal. Humza Yousaf's wife is Palestinian. His mother-in-law is trapped under the bombing in Gaza, and he has suggested that Scotland be the first to, quote, offer safety and sanctuary to those caught up in these terrible attacks. When it comes to public opinion where you are, Zaha Hassan, are you noticing a shift in the United States?
Well, I mean, you were speaking about protests and demonstrations. I mean, in the U.S. yesterday, hundreds of young Jewish Americans took over the Capitol building and staged a very loud and energetic protest. And their slogan was "Mourn the dead and protect the living." And I think that's an important message for members of Congress to hear right now, because what we're getting from members of Congress is not a reflection of a public opinion in the U.S., which is very much against attacks on civilians, whether they're Israeli or they're Palestinian. And there's been a widespread support in the U.S. for an even-handed approach towards the Israel-Palestine conflict. So you saw an expression yesterday on Capitol Hill in which Jewish Americans being very loud and very vocal, because it's been very troubling, to be honest with you, because many members of Congress have been using language that is incredibly dehumanizing, saying that Israel has a right to attack civilians. Literally, the Senator Lindsey Graham specifically said Israel should level the place. Without regard to the 2 million Palestinians, 1 million of whom are children in Gaza. So it's been, there's a disconnect between public opinion and where Americans are and where their elected leadership in government are.
Do you feel the same disconnect here at times? Especially we have the Law and Order Interior Minister trying to ban those demonstrations, now getting into a row with footballer Karim Benzema, accusing him of being in the Muslim Brotherhood, which Benzema has staunchly denied, saying he was just supporting civilians in Gaza.
Well, first I see that in Jordan, everywhere in the Arab countries, the demonstrations were well held and refrained from too much violence. So I would not understand why France is not capable of doing this.
And your thoughts, Jean de Glignasti, on the fact that we've had for the third day in a row rallies outside the French embassy in Tunis. Why the French embassy?
Well, because we had a mandate on Tunisia. We have close relations with Tunisia, as well as other Maghrebian countries. And I think if they want to express some discontent, they do that in front of the French embassy. Is that going to have an influence on Emmanuel Macron going forward? He said he wants to go when the time is right. Yes.
To Israel. What will he bring? The same message that we've seen from people like Rishi Sunak?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think he should go to Israel and to other Arab countries, of course. If he does only Israel, it will be a mistake, especially regarding the Muslim minority in France. So he has to do the whole job, if I can say so. But most probably, he will say that there was the first horrific event, then there is a humanitarian problem, and then there should be some kind of political process. I don't say solution, fortunately it's far away, but at least a political process.
At least a political process. You heard Zaha Hassan talking about those in the United States arguing for a more moderate view when it comes to how the U.S. looks at what's going on in the Middle East. Tuesday's attack on the hospital in Gaza City certainly changing the equation. On his trip back from Israel on Wednesday to Washington, Joe Biden repeating what he had said, that's warning against overreach, talking of the United States' mistakes when it had the world's sympathy after 9/11. Again, he repeated what he said in Israel, that sort of message to the Israelis on Air Force One.
Israel has been badly victimized, but, you know, the truth is that if they have an opportunity to relieve the suffering of people who have nowhere to go, they're going to be, it's what they should do. And if they don't, they'll be held accountable in ways that may be unfair, but that's what we should. And my point to everyone is, look, if you have an opportunity to alleviate the pain, you should do it, period. And if you don't, you're going to lose credibility worldwide.
Well, joining our conversation, we're pleased to welcome Gershon Baskin, who acted as go-between in negotiations with Hamas for the release of Franco-Israeli hostage Gilad Shalit, and who today is columnist with the Jerusalem Post and Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds. When you listen to Joe Biden warning Israelis they could lose credibility worldwide, what's your reaction?
Look, I think that he has a point when one looks at the video pictures coming out of Gaza, the destruction, 600,000 people homeless, 3,500 deaths, many of them innocent civilians. I was discussing with some colleagues this evening how each side only sees the pictures of its own side. Israelis are not seeing the pictures of Gaza, and the Palestinians are not seeing the pictures of what the horrendous things that the Hamas did in Israel. But I don't really think that's the issue. The issue is that we have a real crisis here where Israel feels very strongly that it can no longer accept having Hamas as the ruling party that threatens Israel's existence next to it. And at the same time, we have a hostage crisis of more than 200 Israelis, women, children, elderly, and sick people who are being held, and a population of 2.2 million people in Gaza who are also widely innocent victims on the attack that's taking place and will continue to take place because of the leadership they have. Now, this has a much broader context that we have to consider as well, because maybe this will be a wake-up call for Israel to understand that you can't occupy another people for 56 and have peace, and you can't lock 2.2 million people in an open-air prison and expect them to be quiet. I think that what Hamas did went beyond what humanity can tolerate. It was not a legitimate act of resistance. It was brutal terrorism, and they need to pay the price for it. But the Palestinian people are paying the price for it because Hamas has brought the Palestinian cause back 75 years. And this is tragic. We're in a tragic reality with events that are right now the most traumatic events that have happened to Israel since its founding, and the most traumatic events happening to the Palestinian people since the Nakba, their catastrophe in 1948. And what we're going to have tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to live in this reality where everyone is going to remember what happened. No one is going to forget. It's going to be part of our narrative forever. And somehow, sometime, with some people, we're going to have to learn to look forward and not only backwards, because eventually this war will end and we're going to have to pick up the pieces.
So how do you do it? There's so much hate right now. How do you do it?
I think that the first stage after this war will be when we Israelis and we Palestinians hold our leaders accountable for how they brought us to where we are today. I think that the Israeli government and Netanyahu have to pay the price and take the responsibility for not only the failure of letting Israel's borders be breached, so Israel, the complete collapse of Israel's defense, but the fact that he has prevented any sincere and genuine peace process from happening in the last 15 years. And the Palestinians are going to have to take their leaders to task for having a divided leadership, for having a non-democratic leadership, for even the good leader in Ramallah is in the 18th year of a 4-year term. And they have brought extremist fanatics to govern them. And they're going to have to, particularly the young people, are going to have to stand up and say no more. What I've been talking about, the Belfast moment, when we realize that we've had enough suffering, we've had enough killing, and we need these young people who are going to stand up and have new ideas and new dreams and new visions and the ability to gather other people around them. Because what we all lack here is hope for a better future, and revenge is not the way to get that hope.
Zaha Hassan, it's that question, which Israelis and which Palestinians do you get to sit down and negotiate with? We all saw last Saturday the images in Doha between Hamas's exiled leader Ismail Haniyeh and the Iranian foreign minister, a reminder that one side's terrorists are the other side's allies / proxies. So we're not at the point that Gershon would like us to be right now.
We're not there. We're far away from there.
We're very far away from there. But how do you go about it? What's the answer you can give to Gershon here?
Well, first of all, we need to remember that the people in Gaza did not vote for Hamas. Most of them are children. So the idea that, this is all an issue of Palestinians selecting the right leadership, I don't think is quite what the problem is. I think the problem is that we have an asymmetrical situation here in which Palestinians are an occupied people living under occupation, and you have an international community led by the U.S., which has monopolized the role that it's played as facilitator of negotiations. You have a U.S. that has been acting as Israel's lawyer, according to a former State Department official who's also my colleague here at the Carnegie Endowment, Aaron David Miller. And so, it's incredibly hard to think about an occupied people not only having to deal with their occupying power that is trying to enlarge the territory that it has into the West Bank and entrench control over the West Bank, at the same time as trying to deal with a superpower that's against. Let's speak
practically here, because there's these two speeds. There's one, getting the humanitarian aid in, and we know that Hamas is speaking with the likes of Turkey and Qatar and in Egypt for negotiations. But then there's the broader issue: who do you negotiate with?
So let's talk about that. First, let's think through this logically. You have 200 hostages inside of Gaza right now, and Israel, despite that, is bombing Gaza to oblivion at this point. Is that a good strategy if you're thinking about getting hostages out? Is starving all the people of Gaza, including the hostages, a good strategy for getting the hostages home safely? So
what's the answer as Hamas keeps firing rockets as well?
We need international intervention. People like Egypt with Jordan and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which Israel has an interest in having normalized relations with, getting together with the UN and the U.S. acting as a constructive partner here to demand a ceasefire, because that is the only way. There is no negotiating right now with Hamas, and it's not an issue of just Hamas right now. It's also an issue of restraining an Israeli government that is bent on revenge against a civilian population. So what needs to happen is both sides need to be forced into stopping the fighting so that we can get aid in.
And you heard Joe Biden on that point. Has he been effective in trying to get Israel to soften its stance?
it's good, I think, that he's having private conversations with the Israelis to, tamp down on the violence that we're seeing on the ground in Gaza. But I think it needs to be much more active in terms of rallying the international community. I don't think it was very constructive of the United States to veto a watered-down resolution in the Security Council that would have allowed for a pause, at least a pause, not even a ceasefire, but a pause to allow humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. So I think it's really incumbent upon the international community, coalition of the willing, the global South with the global North, pushing for the U.S. to be a constructive actor here.
Jean de Glignesti?
Well, I think we are living in a transitional period. Up to now, everybody thought that the Americans could sort of negotiate and help finding a balance in the Middle East.
Because on the hashtag F24Debate, we've had viewers saying to us that they're waiting for a Charles de Gaulle or a Jacques Chirac moment so that some other player comes in and...
Even Charles de Gaulle and Jacques Chirac couldn't do anything now. I think Israel has to understand that it has to negotiate its own balance in the region. I don't think Biden has such a power on Netanyahu because the security question of Israel is so existential, especially after these horrific events, that Israel will decide alone. We have perhaps to convince Israel to take into account the balance in the region and so on. But the fact is that during 20 years, everybody agreed, including the Arab states, including the Russians and the Chinese, that the Israeli policy would be, well, to lock Gaza, to extend creepingly, if I can say so, the colonization in the settlements in Jordan, and to normalize with the Arab states. And everybody was okay with that. And what happened, of course, put an end to this process. And now we are entering a new process. And in this new process, Israel has to
So, Jean de
negotiate
Glignesti,
itself.
you were consul in Jerusalem in the 1990s, at the time of the Oslo Accord. You heard Gershon Baskin there talk about a Belfast moment, that time in the 1990s when the Irish decided to end an 800-year-old argument that they were having amongst themselves. In the case of, I'm not asking for a history lesson as to what happened in the 90s, 25 years ago, but I'm asking to you, why is it so inflammatory today?
Well, because as I told you just before, 20 years of mistake, I would say so, and mistake of the whole international community. And at the end of this process now, everybody will understand that we have to start a new process. But the question is that during all this period, what happened?
Who leads that process?
Well, it will be Israel, because Israel has special responsibility. It has to understand that its own security.
But the mediation effort, who leads it?
Well, there could be some mediator, but in fact, the responsibility is Israel's. And of course, but now the Arab states are in a different state of mind. Provided that Biden convinced more or less the Israelis to refrain from too violent action in Gaza, which would raise, of course, very strong and violent reaction in the Arab states. But now we must admit that the Palestinian Authority is discarded by its own citizens, by the Palestinians. It has no authority anymore. We have to admit that the two-state solution is hampered by 500,000 settlers,
Jewish settlers in the West Bank.
So it will be more difficult now.
Gershon Baskin?
Yeah, listen, first of all, we've been talking about a two-state solution for 25 years, 30 years. I've been supporting a two-state solution since 1975. It's probably not viable anymore, but what drives me crazy more than anything else is hearing all these OECD countries, EU countries, the United States and others still talking about a two-state solution and only recognizing one of those states. Let's get real here. If you're talking about a peace process, and it's based on two states, then at least recognize the second state. But I question the viability of a two-state solution, at least as it was conceived throughout the failed Oslo peace process. The worst situation that we can have is another American peace initiative, another American-led peace initiative. This has to be a regional thing. It has to be led by the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it has to involve Egypt and Jordan and the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And the more the better in the region. We need regional arrangements with a new architecture for life in the region, which is not based on normalization with Israel, the occupier, but normalization with Israel and Palestine that are genuinely sitting together, working under the principle that everyone who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea have the same right to the same rights. That's where we start. And then we can figure out if we want 1 state, 2 states, 3 states, or 10 states, a federation or a confederation. These are decisions that the local people need to make. It has to be led by Israelis and Palestinians and the neighborhood and supported by others outside Europe and America, etc.
And you heard Jean de Glignasti saying the initiative has to come from Israel itself. Do you
sense? It has to come from both Israel and the Palestinians.
And the Palestinians.
It can't just come from Israel. It has to also come from the Palestinians.
Yeah, I'm haunted by something you said earlier about the current players. We talked about them, the current leadership in the Palestinian territories being discredited. In Israel, hardly a day goes by since October 7th when some senior official doesn't come out with a public apology for the stunning security lapses ahead of Hamas's October 7th attack. On Tuesday, it was the head of military intelligence. Before him, the head of the Shin Bet domestic intelligence services. And last week, the country's national security advisor.
Right, the only one who wasn't.
It's my mistake, and it reflects the mistakes of all those making assessments over the years, but even more so in the recent period. We really believed that Hamas learned the lesson from the Guardian of the Walls, during which it was hit with a decisive blow.
Koshel, there's one man who has not apologized so far.
We wonder who. It's you're referring to Benjamin Netanyahu, of course. I do want to say something about everything we've heard. Of course, the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu, is responsible for the fact that they kept on building new settlements. They've brought more distress among Palestinians, more frustration, more violence. But the Israelis were also extremely disappointed once they pulled out. They had the impression that was an effort of pulling out of the Gaza Strip. They had the impression. Yeah, for the people who were like not on the left, who were pretty centrist, to get them on board to go further, they were disappointed that that led to rocket fire. That's what many people feel, and that's people who could have gone with a peace deal. Many Israelis were even in favor of dividing Jerusalem, which was like never heard of at the time of Ehud Barak, when he continued Rabin's plan. But many have now turned even more radicalized. Of course, there are many people who hope for peace, and we see that even among the families of the hostages and people who were killed this week, they still say, no, the only solution is peace. We don't want any more victims, Palestinian victims or Israeli victims. So we hear, but we see the society is extremely divided because the radicals are extremely active. Right after the Hamas infiltration, maybe they were not as vocal, but we've been seeing more incitement online. We don't know where they're planning some plans to maybe reinvade the Gaza Strip, maybe popping in the heads of some of the most radicalized leaders. So this also needs to be taken into account. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't taken responsibility for dividing society, for bringing in more hate, more insecurity, of course. But many, even people who are close to Likud or in Likud, say that his days are numbered.
Zaha Hassan, how do you take on those that are radicalized on both sides?
I mean, the thing that has radicalized folks is a lack of a political solution on the Palestinian side. If you think about it, all of the violence before October 7th been directed. It's been directed at the West Bank. The West Bank, where you have a Palestinian Authority that has been Israel's security guarantor. But still, we've had settler violence and we've had Israeli troops protecting the settlers and shooting at and blocking Palestinians from trying to protect their homes and families. So I don't think it's a question of just Palestinians in Gaza. They're just supporters of Hamas. I mean, we have a systemic structural problem, which is that Israel is a state that has defined itself as exclusively for the Jewish people, and it has, by constitution, its quasi-constitution has said that expanding into the West Bank is a high priority, a national priority. So this is the problem at the end of the day, is how to stop the insatiable desire for Israel to expand and to take over and Palestinian land and to remove the people from the land. That's the essence of the problem, and that can only be solved with international intervention.
And do you agree with Gershon Baskin that that intervention should come from near, not far, from the regional players, not from the United States?
I think right now they have a lot more cachet at this point because of the interest that Israel has in normalizing and being regionally integrated. And so there is an opportunity now. Egypt and Jordan are also neighbors. They have a lot of influence over the situation too. I think they are recognizing now that the solution for the Palestinians is being pushed upon them. And now they have even a greater incentive to mobilize together along with Saudi Arabia and other actors that have some cachet with Israel to try to push for an international conference at this point.
What happens next? Jean de Guignesti.
Well, it's true, but provided that Israel's action should not be too much violent, because if the ground action in Gaza is too violent, you will have an uprisal in the Arab world.
Some are even wondering if there will be a ground action. Gershon Baskin, it was 5 years liberating one single hostage. Now there is, according to the latest figure, 203.
Yeah, so let me tell you that there are negotiations going on now as we speak at the official level. Unfortunately, not direct negotiations, but they are being led by the Qatari government. And I don't want to go into details, but what's being talking about, but whatever is being talked about will delay a ground operation by Israel. It won't put it off entirely. And what is being talked about is mostly what Hamas has said in public already now on 3 occasions, that they're talking about a release of the civilian hostages, which are broadly defined as the women, the children, the elderly, and the sick. They will still hold on to a sizable number of hostages that they intend to negotiate from their side the release of all the Palestinian prisoners in Israel, which is more than 7,000 people. That is very unlikely to happen. Not only the release of those numbers, but I would think that even those negotiations won't happen. And I think that after there would be a humanitarian release of the women, children, elderly, and sick hostages, there will be a renewal of the military actions.
So basically, excuse me for saying it so coldly, writing off the remaining hostages?
No, the plan is what Israel is doing now, and we can assume that they're doing it much better than they defended the border, is collecting an enormous amount of intelligence information from the hundreds of telephones that they took off the bodies of terrorists that were killed in Israel. And Israel has the technological ability to enter any telephone in Gaza, and they must be collecting tactical information about the warfare plans of Hamas, the tunnels, the booby traps, and I'm sure that they're listening to many, many phones in Gaza who are chatting away about where hostages might be. This is not holding one soldier with very disciplined troops who are cut off from the world. The 4 guards of Gilad Shalit were the same 4 people the 5 years and 4 months that he was in captivity, and almost no one in Hamas knew where they were. Very, very few people did. You can't keep 200 people hidden. Plus, they're not only held by Hamas, they're held by Islamic Jihad and PFLP, and apparently individual combatants who crossed the line with weapons and took hostages themselves. So there will be military options with special forces who will try to rescue hostages. We can imagine that some of these hostages are soldiers, and they're people who are strange, who may is strong, who may try to overtake their keepers. I think that the fact that they're less disciplined and not the top fighters of Hamas also lends to the possibility that some of them may evacuate their post when push comes to shove and they think they're going to die. All the keepers of hostages will be killed by Israel, and people must be aware of that. And I think that Israel is offering people who give up hostages to have amnesty and a bunch of money to go anywhere in the world they want to go.
Is it the same Hamas as 5 or 10 years ago?
Definitely not. Not the same Hamas that I knew 3 months ago.
What happened? What changed?
I don't know what turned Hamas into ISIS. I think Hamas themselves are surprised at what happened. The biggest surprise was how easy it was to cross that border. And then once it was open, many more people crossed it who were supposed to. But Hamas was guilty of the massacre they did on the Music and Dance Festival. This was Hamas. It wasn't jihad. It wasn't others. They were on their Toyota vehicles with mounted machine guns and anti-tank missiles and RPGs, and they massacred 270 innocent people at a music and dance festival. That was them. So they can't just say we were planning to attack 2 army bases and abduct soldiers, because they could have done that. That's what they did with Gilad Shalit. That's legitimate resistance, an army going against an army. What they did was brutal acts of terrorism that were not out of the Hamas code book. They were out of another code book that we've seen in other parts of the Middle East.
Zaha Hassan?
Yeah, I think what happened was shocking and horrific. We don't have all of the information yet. Like Gershon, I've heard that there were 2 waves. The first were the Hamas fighters, and then a second wave came that don't look like they were Hamas uniformed fighters. They might have been others that took advantage of the opportunity, and so we need more information about exactly what happened to Hamas that we have all come to know. There's also a lot of I wouldn't compare Hamas to ISIS just yet until we get more information about the responsibility. And there's been so much disinformation about beheadings of children and these kinds of claims that have come out that have been disproven later. So I think we need to just take a breath and gather information and figure out exactly what happened before we can really make assessments about this being a Hamas-only thing or maybe a Hamas plus.
Shirley Sitbon.
Well, first of all, for the various waves of people, there is CCTV footage of various areas, and we can see that the fighters are coming in first. Then we see various waves of people coming in as time went along. And I imagine there's more information yet, but this is what everyone has access to. And secondly, the atrocities are there. They were filmed, and the children, the women, the elderly people, they were massacred. They were tortured. That's been documented. So that's not disinformation. That's what happened. Of course, that does not justify any killing of other innocent civilians, but this has happened. It's documented.
I'm talking about the beheadings specifically.
There are pictures of beheaded people. There are pictures. We looked at them. We didn't want to, but we asked for them. And the people, I said, "You're crazy. You want to look at this?" And yes, because people are telling us this is disinformation. So we asked to look at them.
Jean-Luc Vignesti, the difference is, of course, social media, and it's to a certain degree. What we're discussing here are images that have just been thrown out there raw into the public eye.
Yes, I think it's a big difference. I would like to go back to the difference between in Hamas 20 years ago and now. 20 years ago, Hamas was a nationalist party with some Islamic tendencies. Of course, in their charter, they had the destruction of Israel. But I remember perfectly well when I was in Jerusalem, some head of Hamas, which was killed afterwards by the Israelis. But he told me, okay, we want the destruction of Israel, but if we have a state inside the 1967 borders, as a first stage, of course, we'll agree with that. It was 20 years ago.
And now things at times have certainly changed. We'll have to leave it there. So much more to talk about. Jean-Luc Vignesti, I want to thank you. I want to thank you as well Shirley Sitbon, Zaha Hassan, for being with us from Washington. Gershon Baskin in Israel, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.